On behalf of Washington University in St. Louis,
The Ohio State University,
Bloomberg Philanthropies,
HBCU Climate Change Consortium,
the City of St. Louis,
City of Columbia, Missouri,
Second Nature,
the College of Menominee Nation,
University of Wisconsin in Madison,
the University of Michigan,
USDN, Urban Sustainability Directors Network,
the University of Minnesota,
Indiana University.
Welcome to the Midwest Climate Summit. For more than a century, the Midwest has fed our nation and manufactured our goods,
leading to unprecedented growth and prosperity. But today, we face a great challenge.
The Midwest is already feeling the impacts of a changing climate. We are experiencing increased seasonal flooding, droughts, and heat waves.
And we're seeing a greater number of extreme weather events. All of this puts lives at risk, and it destroys crops, it strains infrastructure, and it burdens the economy.
We invite you to participate in the Midwest Climate Summit today and in the months ahead,
as we come together to develop a coordinated Midwest response to the climate crisis.
The next decade is critical to avoid the worst impacts of a changing climate.
And the Midwest is uniquely positioned to develop solutions given our strengths across many sectors.
In fact, our leadership will create jobs, improve health, make our communities more resilient to natural disasters, protect our cherished natural resources,
and position the Midwest to attract top talent and major employers in the coming years.
This work can be done and must be done in a manner that creates opportunities for all of our communities, rural, suburban, and urban.
especially those that have been left behind even as the overall economy has expanded.
This critical work is going to require leadership from all sectors and all communities throughout the Midwest.
Thank you for joining us. We are energized by the talent and the expertise that is coming together, and we look forward to the great things we will accomplish for our future. Now, let's get started.
Good morning, and welcome to the second session of the Midwest Climate Summit Fall Series. My name is Phil Valko, and I will be serving as the MC throughout the series. The Midwest Climate Summit has been planned and is being hosted by a remarkable group of over 20 partner organizations who have come together to develop a coordinated Midwestern response to the climate crisis. As we get started, I'd like to recognize and thank the steering committee organizations and individuals who have contributed a tremendous amount of time and expertise to plan and host these virtual events. I encourage you to visit the Midwest Climate Summit website to learn more about the individuals, institutions, and organizations that made this series possible, and we're able to offer the fall series at no cost thanks to the generous support of Bloomberg Philanthropies. I'd also like to thank the dozens of student leaders from throughout the Midwest who have been an integral part of the planning process and provided the vision and leadership behind the student-focused elements of the summit, including the Climate Stories Competition, the Student Systems Conference taking place November 6th, and the virtual job and networking fair planned for November 13th. If you are a student, please be sure to visit the website to learn more. We kicked off the series last Friday with remarks and discussion with Dr. Robert Bullard, Chris Caldwell, Catherine Wilkinson, Heather McTier-Toney, and Isra Hersey that laid a foundation for thinking about the intersection of climate action and racial equity, as well as the critical importance of centering the people and the communities throughout the Midwest in our climate work. The series continues today with a keynote panel on the future of extreme weather events in the Midwest. Following the keynote panel, there will be a set of 4 concurrent workshops featuring a phenomenal lineup of speakers and participants. The event today and the 3 upcoming events on October 23rd, November 6th, and November 20th will all include both a keynote session and concurrent workshops. The workshops today and throughout the remainder of the fall series are organized around 4 topic areas: climate action, science and research, outreach and engagement, and teaching and education. The keynote sessions and the workshop sessions have been thoughtfully planned to follow an arc throughout the fall series, with each complementing and building on the previous sessions. The content has been developed with a specific eye towards advancing a set of objectives for each of the 4 tracks. I encourage you to visit the Our Mission section of the website to learn more about the objectives. To view the topics for the keynotes and workshops, visit the Event Details tab on the website, and finally, visit the speaker lineup page to see the incredible group of speakers who will be part of the workshops and the plenaries. We encourage you to attend and actively participate in as many of the sessions this fall as you are able. And please help us spread the word about this series by sharing it with your networks. Next, I'd like to start with a poll. This is a poll developed by our Science and Research Subcommittee to learn more about who is with us today. You'll see the poll question in the box below the video viewer. And if you're viewing in full screen mode, you'll need to exit full screen mode to answer the poll question. The question is, what was the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which has been continuously measured by the observatory at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, the decade that you were born? For those of you that don't have atmospheric carbon dioxide levels memorized, select your answer based on the decade you were born, which is shown in parentheses. We'll pause here for a moment to allow the poll results to come in. That is phenomenal. It's great to see that we truly span generations here in the virtual room. And I saw, I think, 1 or 2 members of the audience who are 10 or under, which is really remarkable. The poll itself is a stark reminder of how much human emissions have caused CO2 levels to rise. As of September 2020, atmospheric CO2 levels were at 411 parts per million and steadily rising. There is a true urgency to our work. So thank you everyone for filling out the poll. Now, I would like to introduce Gabriel Filippelli, who will introduce and moderate the panel. Gabe is a Chancellor's Professor of Earth Sciences at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, also known as IUPUI, and is a founding faculty member of Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. He studies and teaches on issues related to climate change, human health, and environmental equity. Gabe is the editor-in-chief of the American Geophysical Union journal, GeoHealth, and led the Health Impacts chapter of the Purdue University Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. Take it away, Gabe.
Well, thanks so much, Phil. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome everyone to this keynote panel. When our committee of scientists and researchers came together to discuss the most important threats and opportunities that climate change poses for the Midwest, we concurred that extreme events and impacts will likely be among the greatest issues over the next several decades. Clearly, extreme climate events are all over the news, from Australian wildfires that started the year to a record hurricane season to now California gigafires. And who can forget the climate and ecological disaster that spurs things like this global pandemic? But many challenges exist right here in the Midwest as well, which are difficult but solvable. For example, we clearly need to throw out our flood risk models. With a 500-year and then a 1,000-year flood hitting South Bend, Indiana, within 3 years. Obviously, the stats don't line up with that. And add in heat waves, harmful algal bloom outbreaks, and a derecho or two, and we have plenty of our own homegrown extremes to grapple with. But we really are in an ideal position to use climate science to prepare our towns and cities to be climate resilient. The Midwest can be a climate solutions incubator, but it has to be solutions for all. We have to be thinking about climate injustice in the vulnerable populations. And we might need that equitable resilience, given the potential for substantial climate migration from the coast. We hope to show you how science and research can be leveraged to help build networks, community of practices, and creative think tanks like this one that take on the challenges that climate change pose and to shine. I'm so pleased to be joined today by some amazing scientists and thinkers from the Midwest for this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to engaging all of you in this dialogue. If you want to engage further with me, you can find me at Gabe Filippelli on Twitter. First off, I would like to introduce Dan Vimont. Dan is a climate scientist in the Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences Department at University of Wisconsin-Madison and directs the Nelson Institute Center for Climatic Research. He also works closely with the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, a grassroots organization that brings scientists and practitioners together to advance climate change solutions in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. You can find Dan at Dan Vimont on Twitter. Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Gabe. And thanks everyone for having me here. I was asked to come and talk a little bit about the science of climate change and science of extreme events. And I want to begin by talking a little bit about some of our experiences with climate change and what we might expect. And the main result here is that our experience is in line with what our model projections are telling us that we should expect from climate change. So I'm going to begin with looking at changes in precipitation. So here in Wisconsin, the name of the game is wetter and warmer. Wisconsin has experienced at least 21 100-year rainfall events, so 24-hour rainfall events in the last decade. And that doesn't include multi-day events. And I know we're not alone up here in Wisconsin as well. This is something that's been seen across the Midwest. Climate change tells us that this is what we should expect. Our climate science tells us that this is what we should expect with climate change. As our atmosphere becomes warmer, it has the capacity to produce storms that cause more rainfall. And new research is suggesting that really big storms, the 100-year, the 500-year, the 1,000-year events, are most strongly affected. So in fact, in Wisconsin, we expect to see a doubling in frequency of the 100-year, 24-hour rainfall event by mid-century. The climate projections suggest that the most robust increases in rainfall are likely to occur during winter and spring, and we've certainly seen examples of that across the entire Midwest as well. In addition to flooding, that leads to compound events, things where that rainfall interacts with other phenomena, such as warmer temperatures or frozen ground, to create rain on snow events or changes in freezing rain that lead to new kinds of events that sometimes we're not accustomed to. And an important point here is that these changes in extreme rainfall events affect all of us differently and in individual ways. In urban areas, these extreme rainfall events, especially in the Midwest, can be associated with combined sewer overflows, which lead to poor water quality and impacts the human health. In agricultural areas, this rainfall leads to enhanced runoff and erosion, which affects agricultural productivity, water quality, and even access to emergency facilities. In fact, in northern Wisconsin, extreme rain events in the last few years have caused some rural communities to be cut off from emergency services. And I want to emphasize that these extreme flooding events also negatively impact traditional harvest of manoomin, or wild rice, by Native American populations in northern Wisconsin. So these effects these climate changes are affecting lifeways for populations in the Midwest. Beyond rainfall, model projections show that we should expect changes in extreme heat in the Midwest as well. And I want to point out that while model projections suggest an approximate tripling in frequency of extremely hot days, in the upper Midwest, we have not seen large increases in daytime high temperatures yet. The daytime highs aren't the whole story. Here in Wisconsin, the trend in summertime highs may not be significant, but changes in nighttime low temperatures are robust. And it's those nighttime low temperatures that are often more important for human health. If you can't cool off at night, then you don't sleep well, and that exacerbates all kinds of other health issues. Further, when we combine those changes in heat with humidity, we see potentials for perhaps unprecedented heat waves and heat index values that are especially devastating. Here as well, it's important to point out that extreme heat affects us all in individual ways. Work by the Wisconsin Department of Health Services has shown that vulnerability to extreme heat is strongly influenced by social vulnerability. We see this in Milwaukee, where maps of heat vulnerability line up almost one-to-one with maps of historically redlined districts. This highlights an important reality that building resilience to climate change also means addressing social inequities that continue to cause some communities, especially communities of color and indigenous populations, to be especially vulnerable. I want to end by echoing a statement from my colleague, Steve Vavris, who will be joining us later. Steve is the director of the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, and he makes it clear that while we're already experiencing the effects of climate change, and it is inevitable that we will continue to experience these changes, it is not too late to take action to reduce the severity and the rate with which our climate is changing. Further, we need to be taking action to improve our resilience and reduce vulnerability to climate change. So to sum up, our climate is changing in ways that are consistent with our scientific understanding of human-induced climate change. We're experiencing more extreme weather, and we expect that will continue. 2, all of us are affected in individual ways by climate change, and all of us can do something to reduce our vulnerability and help solve this problem. 3, we need to address social and environmental injustices that are being compounded by climate change, especially to communities of color and indigenous communities. And last, we need to be working together. As climate scientists, I don't know how you're impacted. And so developing these kinds of events to start this conversation is critical for us to improve our response to climate change in the Midwest. Thanks, everyone. And back to Gabe.
Thanks, Dan, so much for that. Now I turn to Jessica Hellmann. Jessica is the director of the Institute on the Environment and a professor of ecology, evolution, and behavior at the University of Minnesota. She's an ecologist who studies the effects of climate change and strategies for reducing those effects in natural and in human systems. Her institute works on many aspects of greenhouse gas reduction and climate impacts in agriculture, cities, and natural areas across Minnesota, the Midwest, and indeed the world. You can find her at Jessica Hellmann on Twitter. Jessica, take it away.
Thank you, Gabe. Hello to my fellow panelists and to all of the participants at today's summit. It's really lovely to be with you all. I join you from my home in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the fall colors are currently on spectacular display. And I also want to point out that this house, my home, sits on ancestral lands of the Dakota people, which is something good to hold in our minds. Another important thing I want to hold in our minds in my short remarks is that we live in a region that is already and will increasingly be affected by climate change, as Dan just eloquently described. And sit with that for a second. That's a sobering and pretty scary fact. Climate change is here, climate change is coming. And for us, extreme events are likely to be particularly important. At the same time, our region has a remarkable diversity of assets and capabilities that we can deploy to both stop climate change and to reduce the risks it presents. So I'm excited to be part of this summit because this summit gives us a chance to confront our challenges, but also recognize our strengths and take action. I believe our region has a real opportunity to lead on climate change. In fact, if you think about it, we really have to get this right because millions of people, much of the Earth's productive farmland, and some of the world's most endangered and important ecosystems, like the native prairies of the Midwest and the Laurentian Great Lakes, they're really counting on us to bring our A game. So having acknowledged this need, but also the possibility and opportunity and responsibility for action, I have 2 points I'd like to share with you in light of confronting increased extremes brought on by climate change. So here's my first point. And that is that we need to understand and appreciate the vulnerability of an ecosystem, a city, a neighborhood, whatever it is that we're talking about. And that vulnerability is determined by a couple of different things. And we can hold these different things separate in our mind and evaluate them separately. The first ingredient to vulnerability is exposure. That's how much the climate is or will change in a particular area. The more exposure you have, the more vulnerable you are and the greater risk you face. We reduce exposure by stopping climate change. And by the way, we really need to do that. Another key ingredient of vulnerability is sensitivity. Sensitivity is determined by the stuff that occurs in an area. What particular species, what economic sectors, or what infrastructure is in that place, and how those things are or will be affected by climate change. The more sensitive a location or area is, the more vulnerable it is. But we reduce sensitivity by taking adaptation actions. So let's apply this framing to climate extremes. Notably, as Dan explained, extreme drought, extreme rainfall, and extreme heat in our region. And when we do that, I think we can see these two ingredients clearly. So climate projection models give us an indication of exposure for the pertinent extremes in our region. Exposure is mostly relatively evenly spread across our geography, though we know that higher latitudes are affected, may be affected more than lower latitudes. But sensitivity varies widely across our region, depending on topography, whether we're talking about farmland or city, the condition of infrastructure, income level, access to education, access to public assistance, and many other factors. When we talk about building resilience, we're working to reduce those sensitivities. When we talk about equity, we're talking about reducing sensitivity for all people and creating resilience in all places. I heard an example of this difference between exposure and sensitivity the other day on the radio, though it is, forgive me, an example from outside our region. And it was with an interview of the mayor of Santa Rosa, California. He was talking about the glass fire racing toward his city and the considerable risk that his citizens and infrastructure were facing. And he did not downplay the reality of that situation, but he also said that it wasn't their first rodeo, that the town of Santa Rosa had experienced fire in 2017 and 2019, and that they had learned from those experiences. And specifically, they learned to build better evacuation and notification plans, and he'd expected those plans to substantially reduce the loss of life and property this time around. In essence, he had reduced the town's sensitivity and vulnerability by increasing its preparedness and essentially its resilience. In our region, we need to figure out what are the greatest sensitivities, where do they lie, and what can we do effectively to reduce them. Second point, quickly, is that while we do that, while we work to reduce sensitivity or increase resilience, we're going to have to do that while under considerable uncertainty. And that's because while climate scientists and climate modelers have made extraordinary progress in predicting and understanding climate change, and they have made predictions at the regional scale that are really useful for specific applications, there are limits to the ability our ability to make predictions about climate extremes. We know that our climate models, when you compare them against historic climate averages, they've been shown to be remarkably robust. But predicting rare but consequential extremes is much more difficult, statistically speaking. Even small changes to very low frequency events could double, triple, or even more increase the probability of those events. So that means that if we're not going to have specific, reliable predictions about these rare but consequential events, we're going to have to account for a wide range of frequencies and possibilities. So we're going to have to be ready for the anticipated, but not exactly aware of when that anticipated change is going to occur. And we can do that by investing in infrastructure and strategies that handle extremes and confer other benefits. We can do it by bolstering emergency preparedness, and we can do it by building systems that adjust quickly and rebound in the face of extremes, systems that are resilient and flexible. So it's going to take experimentation and a kind of social resiliency to do that we're not used to needing. But the creation of new social resilience and preparedness measures, for example, just that is going to get us quite a way down the right road. I'll toss it back to you, Gabe. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jessica. That was great. Our final keynote is Heidi Roop. Heidi combines climate science and climate communication to connect climate change information to decision makers and communities across the Midwest, the US, and abroad. She's an assistant professor of climate science and extension specialist at the University of Minnesota. She also holds an affiliate assistant professorship at the University of Washington School of Public Health. You can find her at Heidi Roop on Twitter. And take it away, Heidi.
Thank you, Gabe. Those are some extremely hard acts to follow. I'm really honored to be part of this summit. Hundreds of people are listening, representing the diverse skills, expertise, and perspectives that we need to confront the challenges and opportunities of climate change. Thank you for being here and for offering your perspectives, your expertise, and your time. Today, we're talking about extremes. To me, this feels particularly apt as we navigate an extremely challenging and pivotal time as a global society. From a pandemic and political extremes to the necessary demand for long overdue social change, and of course, climate extremes. With this backdrop, I imagine the word extreme and the reality that you just heard of extreme climate events, that this conjures up lots of feelings, emotions, concerns, and questions. I have probably the same ones that you do. A quick scan of climate news, which we are increasingly being exposed to, yields words like devastating, catastrophic, unprecedented. This is part of our shared language, a shared lexicon being created before our eyes to describe the world around us. Climate change, as you just heard, is indeed all of these things. For our region and around the world, it's the threat multiplier. Extremes, however, are not just those record-shattering heat waves and floods. When we think about climate events, we also have to think about how they have extreme consequences when they are multiple, when these multiple impacts scaffold across a region or a season. For example, something that a region of our country has just lived through: a cool, wet spring delaying planting, followed by dry summer conditions during the summer, and relentless late summer and autumn rain, all together combine to leading to a crop that can't be harvested or isn't nearly as valuable. These impacts cascade across systems. They have extreme implications for our food system, for our communities, and for our ecosystems. But I think my fellow panelists gave you a very strong sense of that reality and have very well, they've articulated that imperative that we have to get it right. And while our regional solutions-oriented thinking is absolutely paramount, as we put our heads and hearts together during the summit and beyond, as we think about our shared future, we have to remember that while we need to narrow our focus on local and actionable solutions, we can't forget to simultaneously broaden our perspective to understand the consequences and implications of our actions and decisions. Just like the climate system, we are interconnected and complex. Look west, we see wildfire smoke carried by the jet stream to our own backyards. Look north, we see a region warming almost twice as fast as the rest of the world. Look east, look south, our oceans are warming, our coasts are threatened by sea level rise, and we're experiencing stronger and more devastating hurricanes. Climate change needs no passport, and it knows no political or geographic boundaries. Our solutions, our collaborations, our knowledge sharing, and our motivation need to be similarly unbounded. There are many examples, and you just heard some, of individuals and researchers and policymakers and farmers and water managers all working together towards solutions. As an example of a group that I work with, motivated leaders from across the country in the water sector came together to create the Water Utility Climate Alliance. This is a nationwide organization supporting adaptation in the water sector. That's the water we drink, the water we flush down our toilets. They serve and represent over 50 million consumers of water in this country, and they represent and build capacity for adaptation in many more through trainings, knowledge sharing, peer-to-peer learning, and capacity building. These networks exist, they're extremely valuable, the work is being done, but we need to do more. How we feel climate change depends on our actions today to prevent future warming, but also how well we prepare for the changes we set in motion. This is what Jessica just described. So the choice is ours. And while we're a panel of predominantly scientists, to address climate change, we need so much more than science. We need extreme creativity, extreme collaboration, an extreme commitment to emissions reductions, and an extreme investment in knowing that we can choose and need to demand a better, more equitable tomorrow. Let's embrace this opportunity to come together to develop and advance a bold vision for our collective future, one where we are extremely well prepared for climate extremes, where we solve through our climate actions the other extreme problems we are confronting as a region, a country, and a global society. So as we continue this discussion today and over the coming weeks, I challenge you to think about what extreme collaborations and partnerships we can build together. What bold actions can we take as a region? And how can we support one another in finding and maintaining the extreme courage required to boldly confront the challenges and opportunities of climate change? We can create and realize this bold vision. After all, it's extremely important, and the stakes have never been higher. Thank you, Gabe.
Wow, thanks so much, Heidi. Thanks to you all. That's a great way to wrap up. You three were really great and gave us a lot to think about in terms of extreme events, adaptation, climate surprises, and the importance of building creative collaborations to grapple with really the thorny issues of our time. I'm going to go ahead and field a couple questions for you guys and direct them individually that have come in and that we've kind of conceived of already. And Dan, I'm going to turn to you first. Where's the science on climate preparedness not well developed? Where are the gaps in our science, whether it be modeling or hydrologic projections or temperature sensors in cities? Well, where are the gaps in our ability to best prepare and adapt for a just climate future?
That's great. Thanks, Gabe. That's a really good question. I'd say one of the things we've known about climate change and that we will, that is an absolute reality, is that we will be surprised. And some of these compound events, I think, are examples of that. I think we need more capacity, I'm going to say this as a scientist, so, we need more capacity to try and assess how some of these compound events that are especially devastating influence our communities. The flooding we saw, the Mississippi flooding is a good example of this. Freezing rain events, things that are pushing extreme weather, such as tornadoes, supercell thunderstorms, these sort of things. These are pushing the limits of our ability to model these things and to understand the potential impacts of them. And so the science there, I think, is really important. The other thing that I think is really critical here is how we interact. And I thought Heidi's conclusion was just spot on. We need to be thinking about, it is a scientific question to a certain extent, but really we need to be working together to identify how is it, as a climate scientist, how do we develop that communication with people who are being impacted on the ground so that I know what you need. I know the kind of information you need, and that drives my research to be able to assess how our climate system might be changing in ways that are critical for people who are impacted. So I guess those would be my two responses to that.
No, thanks so much, Dan. For you, Jessica, what opportunities do you see to accelerate either local, regional, or even national efforts to prepare for some extreme climate events? What do you see as the low-hanging fruit activities that we can do to be more resilient, frankly, to extreme climate events?
Well, that's a great question. I would say, for one, it helps when we get together and we talk about these ideas at a regional scale. We need to do this at all scales. We need to get together with our neighborhoods and our towns and cities and talk about preparedness, but we also need to be in communication with one another. This is a point Heidi made about the connectedness of climate extremes and climate events. I also wanted to say, in addition to Dan's comment that he just made about scientists being sort of side by side with stakeholders and planners and decision makers so that we can understand what gaps are needed. Another thing that scientists can provide is a way of thinking about scenarios, how these alternative climate events could play out. We don't have sometimes great predictions about exactly what will happen with respect to extremes, but we can be really good at saying what are the possibilities, and that can inform adaptation planning in a very useful way. And I'll give a shout out in answer to your question to some reports and some messaging that I think are really great models to follow. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, for example, put out a report called How We Respond. You can find it on their website, AAAS. That includes a number of case studies that explains how different that focuses on municipalities in particular locations, what they have done to address their local concerns. And I think we need to develop these kinds of best practices and share with one another.
That's great. Thanks, Jessica. I have a question from Demetria, and this is for you, Heidi. What are the top 2 or 3 areas for collaborative research that will most benefit our regional adaptation?
Oh, I have to pick favorites. That's hard. I think, it's important to consider themes. I think Dan outlined some of the bigger impacts. That's one approach for thinking about, how to build collaborations and who needs to be part of collaborations, is thinking about, how is it that we're preparing for changes to our water system? How are we preparing for things like extreme heat, which have really direct and meaningful consequences on public health? So those are maybe 2 big key ones. And I think our food systems being a really important part of driving the U.S. economy here in the Midwest. We really have to think about the industries that our country, that our region has that support the rest of the country and the world, right? Again, we're all very interconnected. So I think those are sort of big topical areas where we can work and how we can think about building collaborations. But I also think we need to frame it in terms of the future that we want. What problems are we solving? Sort of, I'm a trained scientist. I tend to think about what questions are interesting, what science uncertainty exists, and how I can narrow that uncertainty. But I think it's really important we flip that on the head and think about, well, what is it that I want my community to look like? What do I want the region to look like in the future? And think about the solutions we want. And then from there back out, well, who needs to be involved in visioning that solution? And also what information do we need? What expertise, what resources can we bring together to achieve that solution rather than just say constantly chase addressing the problems as they emerge. And so I think there's a real opportunity to think creatively and to think differently in more of a solutions and a positive way that helps us create the communities we want and that, quite frankly, we deserve.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Now quickly, because believe it or not, we only have a couple minutes left. So quick responses if I can. It's a question from Ralph that I'm going to field toward you, Dan. Where can we learn more about specific risks to our areas, like sensitivity maps that might be available to our region or lists of sensitive areas and or populations? Are those resources available?
There are some resources available. I encourage you to look at some of the work by the National Climate Assessment here in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, which I'll point out. And then let's see, there's NOAA has some resources as well. Maybe what we can do is compile a list of resources and share that around after the conference. That's a great question. There's a lot out there. I think we need some more coordination.
Okay, great. And then just very quickly, because we're about done, Jessica, to you real fast, how is Midwest unique in terms of its climate vulnerability and climate solution potential?
Well, we focus on climate extremes because we don't have sea level rise or hurricanes or other things. So those are our primary risks that we likely face. But there are many other dimensions of climate change that we could have talked about in our time together. And for those of you who are joining our breakout, maybe we can spend some time talking about those as well. So that's very quick, Gabe, because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you, Jessica. And Heidi, you get the last sentence. How would you like to walk us off before Phil joins us?
I guess I'll just say with gratitude for everyone who's here. I think in the absence of people participating, we can't even envision a way that we could make progress. And so I'm inspired by the number of people who are joining us remotely and bringing their expertise to bear in these discussions. And I really look forward to participating. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Gabe. So from where you sit, please join me in thanking Gabe, Jessica, Heidi, and Dan for their phenomenal remarks and discussion. Before we shift to the workshops, I have a couple of housekeeping items and reminders. First, if you would like to change and or add workshops to your registration, please email us at the conference at climatesummit@wustl.edu. And you can find that email address at the bottom of the conference website homepage. So again, if you'd like to change or add workshops to your registration, send us an email. We encourage you to use social media throughout the series and tag your posts with hashtag Midwest Climate Summit. Our next session is taking place Friday, October 23rd at 10 a.m. to noon Central. That's 2 weeks from today. The keynote panel was planned by the Climate Action Subcommittee, and it will focus on ambition, economics, and a just transition in the Midwest. Finally, workshop registrations or changes for the October 23rd session must be received by the end of the day on Tuesday, October 20th. People can register for the October 23rd keynote panel up until the actual event. However, workshop registration must be completed by the Tuesday prior to the event. With that, it's time to transition to the workshops. So below your video viewer, you'll see links for the 4 workshops. Please click through to the workshop that you registered for. If you did not register for the workshops prior to the end of the day this past Tuesday, you are still able to view either the Climate Action Workshop or the Outreach and Engagement Workshop. Please be aware that the session today will end in the workshops. So thank you for being with us this morning, and I'll let you click through and enjoy the workshops.